Okay, fesgur ma, fáilte agus tapalaibh a chartin. Is mu leos, sé leosach a hanam, a bach, agus hami an dúich álinn laracia, mar bhaes mar a bhíes gon tortsuas go bra. Har mi urandor shannaran shachat san shannaran anu marichet gesherich. Ha fis ac yn gyn rocartin ac yn fodwch ele. Agus dynnu ele snach ani mi cael, nach tor mi uram gaif agus dor gwych a heen. This text here is to remind myself and to admit to all of us who are listening today that I come from another place, and it's something that will always be part of me. I will always be that person, and I can't claim to be anybody else. I don't need to impose my beliefs, but I don't need to give them up either. I can listen and learn without having to weaken, and this survival is my right and the right of every people. Before I realised these things to say about myself, like most Scots, I had quite a set of confused and inconsistent views about my country and this country and about my place in either. And that's because, having done what young men do, I left my country. When I grew up, just about 7 miles north of Stornoway there, I grew up talking about the incomers from the mainland and from England as settlers. We called them settlers, and we aligned ourselves with Indigenous and colonised people all across the world. Unironically, despite Scottish people being involved in colonisation of other places at other times. And the irony now is that I am now not Indigenous to this place, that we're involved in so many things, and I don't have the right to talk about the people who are from here. I don't have the right to talk for them. And so I'm going to try to keep myself to talking about how they've affected and taught me, and how I and all of us who are now settlers here really have the capacity to affect them for good or ill. On this journey, I've had views that might embarrass me now. I've had shame about my origins and confusion about them. And accepting those views and the confusion was made possible by seeing others having pride in their culture. Now I get strength from that culture and that self-knowledge, and from ownership of the bad bits and the silly bits as well, which hopefully give me some patience and humility. And I was taught to do that in large part by the Aboriginal Ethics Committee. There's a translation of what I said. This acknowledgement of country is easy enough to say. We're sort of, in some cases, scared of it. Sometimes it's sort of gabbled out, and we're worried about the bits of it that we might forget, and if we get it right, it's sort of a formula that wards off the spirits. It's easy to say as we acknowledge something and really give nothing up, and it's been called a settler move to innocence, even thinking that this is going to fix anything. And we live in a country that was established by a merger of colonies. Those colonies and the country that now inherits them were founded on the basis of theft and of violence to cover up the theft, or to justify it when it couldn't be covered up anymore, or to forget it when it's obviously impossible to justify. And that does put the relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people on a footing that's different from the relations between all other groups making up the society at the moment. That's a fundamental fact, and it's different from a lot of other places. It's different from places that weren't colonised entirely, and it's not recognised in any foundation document of the country. It is becoming recognised in research ethics. And when I started working with the Northern Territory Ethics Committee, I was a little bit challenged by the idea that we had a separate place for the Aboriginal members to talk and then come out, and we called it the subcommittee. And there were a few things that made me think that, well, perhaps we're not inclusive enough with this structure. And I want to say that I'll try to speak correctly about these issues, and where I've been advised and seen advice on and by Aboriginal communities, I'll say, for example, Aboriginal Ethics Committee, where possibly I might get that wrong. It might be better at sometimes to say Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. So please do stop me, put your hands up, correct me. And if I use the words Indigenous or First Nations in a way that's incorrect or brings the wrong inference, then I apologise and seek correction any way that you can give it. As with acknowledgements, these things are pretty easy to say, but we should avoid handing over our own burden. We should avoid handing over the adaptive work that we have to do to deal with the moral consequences of colonisation. By hiding behind Aboriginal Ethics Committee review and by hiding behind formulaic acknowledgements. The facts of inception violence and continuing violence do us all harm, because living in this way with these realities all around us as if they're facts of nature rather than a continuing result of continuing injury, rather than a story we create, I think does us all harm. That settler reach for innocence doesn't cancel the moral imperative to recognise what we've done and where we are just now. Until invasion, nobody considered themselves to be an Indigenous Australian. They considered themselves as members of one of their culture, which is one of hundreds of very diverse cultures, each one relating to many dozens of others in complex and dynamic ways that changed over time. Making a world, a system of the world that lasted longer than any other system has ever. And they had reason, therefore, to believe that anybody else visiting here would behave in the same normal way. And that didn't happen. Suddenly there was a label made up that defined everything and that determined access to resources and to resilience, and that determined exposure to things that create bad outcomes. And I think that disaster really does affect us all. It affects those who are on the benefit side of that system of power in a moral way, and it benefits us to try and avoid it and break it down. So Aboriginal people are not vulnerable or weak or other, and setting up an Indigenous, an Aboriginal ethics committee doesn't mean putting all of those concerns off to one side. It does mean giving people a safe space to talk about things without the burden of having to educate people like me every single time. What do we need an Aboriginal ethics committee for? Well, for justice and benefit, and safety and validity here are kind of restatements of the research merit and integrity and the respect phrasings in the national statement. I think it's good to restate things every so often, and that's something again that I often find listening to the reports back from the Aboriginal Ethics Committee, that things are restated in ways that that cut through a lot of the verbal contortions that we have to put ourselves in, that cut through from a very different perspective. Race is a thing that's imposed by others, and it's defined for a political reason. Racism is what gives race its power. It's what initiated the discourse on race. The need to sustain racism as a power system is what sustains race as a critical dividing factor, and it does that through changing people's minds, through changing policy, and sometimes, unfortunately, the work of scientists. I won't call it science, but in the work of scientists. Racism feeds itself, and it needn't be based in any particular race hate, just on division and advantage derived from that, and the power that's entrenched by it, and in secondary gain. You can have racist choices, racist policies, racist societies without the people in those hating anyone, just from being divided and power being allocated on the basis of that imposed race. Ethnicity, on the other hand, is self-defined. It's a fact of belonging to a group where those who belong feel that it is an ethnicity on the basis of cultural or national or historical or language or religious identities. Ethnicity is not free from being a target of racism. But because of that, it's almost always, it appears somewhere in any bad faith discourse about whether people are talking about race or not, or discriminating by race, or whether their effects will be applied by race. None of these things define biological reality. racism and ethnicity can't, except as transmitted social trauma, except as any social factor can influence people's biological lived reality. So I won't talk here about things like the ecogenomic fallacy. I can cover it at the end. So apart from just the need to have a space of one's own to talk about important issues, there are these lived experiences under race and racism that are best and most easily addressed and more powerfully addressed with the greatest moral authority by an Aboriginal Ethics Committee. Cultural security, and this is an important document from the Northern Territory, honours the legitimate cultural rights, values and expectations of a people. Aboriginal cultural security is obtained by embedding Aboriginal cultural values and rights at every critical point of intervention in the service design. So where we're designing a service or where we're delivering a service, to embed those expectations and values in choices we make about designing them. And it might be very subtle, but having an Aboriginal Ethics Committee to act as a sort of expert reference group, expert meta-reference group, to point out where that hasn't been done in the design of the project or in the review processes has been really important for us. Deep listening and empathy are the building blocks of respectful and trusting relationships. And from these, where we're talking about culture as something that distances researchers from participants, we need cultural humility. Colonisation has some necessary results for it to achieve its desired output, which is a power differential. But it's like any violence, it's got complex and intimate aspects and things that resonate through time. And this is where the topic knowledge of an Aboriginal Ethics Committee comes in. Does the participant information sheet really need to be 16 pages long with multiple signatures? Does it need to feel like a contract? Because hot tip, participant information sheets and consent forms are not contracts. The PIS really should be the bit that you show your mum to explain why you've made your choice. And the consent conversation and the consent relationship is where you come to a common deep understanding with the researcher about what you're jointly involved in. We sit on ethics committees, and so we must want good to be done, and we try and consider things from all sides to which we have access. We imagine ourselves in situations, and we try to imagine people who are very different from us in those same situations. But have you ever reviewed a submission from a researcher who seems like they came up with what seemed like a good idea and are now going to spend the rest of time justifying why it's a good idea, from someone who believes that they can't be wrong because they're right or just because they're nice? Is it possible that we could sometimes be a little bit like that as well? This is a great website to find out what sort of things non-Indigenous people should be asking about themselves, asking about our interactions, asking about our priorities, asking about our failures and where we're not doing things right. Indigenous X is just excellent. This particular part here, debunking, talks about common racist tropes and things that hold people down and things that we might occasionally find ourselves saying, or at least failing to debunk ourselves. We need to do the work as settlers in cultural security, and we can create cultural security, but we need help. We need the pennies taken from our eyes. Cultural humility can be a bit bruising, but that building of self-identity and respect for all others and their self-identity, they all reach towards cultural security and make it more likely that we can ask the questions that are necessary to challenge our own behaviour and our own permission of other people's behaviour. Rather than asking impertinent or aggressive questions about other people's culture, really true curiosity comes from realising things about ourselves and asking what that means. So the help that I've had from the Aboriginal Ethics Committee, I've had opinions and positions that are now pretty embarrassing, and I won't list them all because they're embarrassing, but I arrived in the NT very curious about all the cultures. So I asked lots of questions and bought lots of books. And not directly, but very subtly, but very staunchly, I got the advice, first of all, to put myself in the position of the participant. And when I'm reading those books by Baldwin Spencer, those things that sort of semi-consent for photographs and are now used as representatives of whole cultures, what would it mean to be a person now who is represented by their own story, but by an old dead white man's gaze? When reading the research proposals, what does it mean to be an object of study? And when using research to recommend actions in clinical practice or in policy writing, to think about whether the answers that were derived from it are really for the participants or for some sort of notion that the researchers have imposed on them. Again, we still have to do the work. Where there is a power differential, we need to be open to the help we'll get. And it's help that's offered with an open heart from Indigenous people to do that work. How hard must it be to explain all of this every time to every Balanda, to every settler? I think of the last 10 years of my identity, and I just think about the patience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to sit through while I was working through that and asking the stupid questions, and to still sit with me as I'm asking questions that I will later realize have been stupid. That's a lot to unpack, and there's not enough time in the day for one, let alone every single Balanda. And it's important for First Nations people to be able to sit with others who understand bits of the background in ways that settlers won't easily understand, to have a place where some things don't need to be said or debunked or defended. They don't need to be said because they're painful, but they're understood and important, and they form a background to how you view the research proposals and how you think about it. Just to get an authentic and strong voice from Aboriginal people without putting them under the stress of having to explain this to ignoramuses like me is very important. And there are plenty of stories showing how knowledge was shared for the whole of time between very different people in the foundation times. Deep understanding of all that needs to be known is an expectation in most cultures. Most cultures would expect deep understanding of whatever is important to know. Consider the participant, be a human, commit to relationships, and consider benefit. Benefit doesn't need to mean false claims about saving the world. It can just be as simple as giving detailed feedback and results in a way that is useful to and respectful of the people on whom the results will be practiced. Where benefit builds cultural security is when people are given the chance to redesign a project. We've heard all about this already, from the hypothesis through the measurement instruments to recruitment strategies, decision trees about how the results will be presented, all the way through to presentation to clinicians, policymakers, the wider public, who are then going to be in a position to stop using the violence that we regularly do. The credibility of a research team might come from the research pedigree, in other areas from the current tight protocol, or just from personal history of acting to produce trust. And out of that credibility comes acceptability of research processes. Things that might seem safe for settlers might have an obvious and loud warning sign attached for colonized people. It might not quite be the same for everyone, but for example, signing forms often turns out badly for colonized people. And it takes more trust than for people who have no family history of child removal or false imprisonment, let alone much worse. You might write in your participant information sheet a teaspoonful of blood. That might be terribly distasteful language, and it might damage trust in an otherwise really good project where you could write 5 milliliters, because people know what that means because they're not stupid. More epidemiologically, we should consider how assumptions can cause harm. Could well-meaning research, yet grounded in a racist system, repeat past errors? And so could we end up excluding children from cochlear implants? Yes, we could, and we did. Could we end up excluding Aboriginal patients from having kidney transplants? Yes, we could, we did. Could we end up excluding Aboriginal patients from having further future interventions that are of benefit? Finally, a lot of what I've said here has been quotations, but here are some direct challenges from a couple of members of the Aboriginal Ethics Committee. So give power, give vetoes, give space and give time, give the right to say no to part or all of the research, to stop research and think. This is all in the national statement. It's just, it's still a challenge that needs to be issued. Give voice and repeat and attribute things to those who made it up. Really give the reins. Say something positive. Say your piece in a positive way, or a way that looks to the future and to survival rather than to weakness or vulnerability or some sort of inherently deserving what has happened. Be genuine and curious and try to figure out when you're being told things. Aboriginal people don't always want to have to tell you when you're being told. They're always very respectful of different worldviews. And if you're open and curious, then you can learn little bits of that generosity and integrity. The leaders I've worked with on the Aboriginal Ethics Committee are people of real standing and staunch positions. They've never used that standing, but they've just demonstrated why they have it with really subtle skills. And think about culture for every participant. And finally, consider that if let's say, if you as a settler can get it right for colonized people, then you clearly have the motivation and the skills to get it right for everybody. And to do this, you'll have to have your own cultural identity and culture. And I'll end there.